The name of Ron Tauranac will be very familiar to people interested in historic motorsport, and his face maybe as well to many people, but we don't often get a chance to speak to somebody who's had so much experience in the past in motor racing. So I'd like to ask a few questions about your career and the cars you've been involved with. Starting off really with the Ralt cars in Australia, the first generation of Ralt cars, which you built with your brother. What were they like to drive and how do they compare with the competition?
Well, the first car was really what was a Formula 3 car in the UK at that time, and I'd read a few little magazines of current Autosports or whatever the equivalent was then, and heard about Formula 3, so I managed to get an old motorbike engine and built a car, and I think I'd read various articles by Lawrence Pomeroy and things about Mercedes and Auto Union, so I designed a car with no knowledge other than what was in the magazine, and built the car, and it was a bit of a disaster. I'd put swinging half axles on the back, and because I'd read that interleaf friction was very good, you didn't need dampers, and I had no money didn't have £10 to buy dampers, so I went without them, and of course first time out on a hill climb, wheels bounced up and down and swung under and turned me over, and I ended up with 14 stitches in my face.
But things got better from there.
Well, it took a while. I think the response was to make the suspension twice as stiff as it should be, so it couldn't happen again, and it took a long while to soften it off and gradually learn out. But I think I probably learnt more from mistakes than from doing things correctly. If you do it correctly, you don't know why the hell you've done it. Whereas you make the mistakes and you fix them up, and we progressed that way. And I think the second car was a sports car for my brother with a Ford engine, and I think similar to the later Sevens, and so we went on from there.
And this is about the sort of time you would have met Jack Brabham, I suppose?
Yes, I'd probably been running like that for about a year, and he advertised an MSS 500 motorbike engine, and I was always interested in pulling things apart and seeing how they worked, and so I went up to buy it, and we arrived in where his workshop was, in his grandfather's house, and he saw the car that we went in, which was my brother's special, and he rather liked that, and we got chatting, and I saw his machine shop and said he'd like to take in subcontract work. At first he refused because he thought it was for my cars, and no one ever paid. I think it's the same now if you get people doing things for motor racing, and I eventually said no. It was for the big company that I work for, and I was subcontracting work for them, so it went on from there, and we seemed to hit it off. We carried on after that, and I did some design mods for his Coopers that he bought, and he did some machining for my Norton engine, etc.
Obviously at that time you were driving and designing. Did you prefer driving or designing at the time?
I don't know that I weighed up the two. I had no option but to design and build a car to be able to race. I think the original intention was to race, but the designing had to happen first.
How did you rate yourself as a driver?
I didn't really. I mean, I just performed, and unfortunately the races there at Mount Druitt were a handicap race, and because of the car I had, I'd qualify fairly well up the grid, so I had to start at the back, and the other cars were often fairly huge V8 engined cars, and they were much quicker down the straight, so they could pass me down the straight, and I didn't have a hope in hell of passing around a corner because there's only room for one. So it went very well. I think the problem I had was that there's a race about once a month, and I modified the car between each race to learn something about it, which is how I found out what makes things work. Whereas when my brother started racing with a similar 500cc car, I had told him how the handicap system worked, and that we entered it on 10-to-1 compression, but actually run it on 7-to-1. And gradually each race we'd increase the compression ratio, and when we caught up, we put it up the next stage, and so he won a race at every meeting, whereas I started off at 14-to-1 on methanol and carried on like that. I think my one big success was winning the New South Wales Hill Climb Championship in 1954, and Jack Brabham came second in a Keeper Bristol, and my brother came third in his 500cc car. But again, for that, I'd read about nitromethane, so I bought some, which was nearly broke me. It was so expensive, and put it in the car and run it up the hill on nitromethane. And I think it had seized the piston rings and they were all broken, so I ended up with an oil plug. And so I just put the warm-up plug in for the next run, which was the successful one, and the spark plug man was there. He said, well, you can't do that. I said, well, it oils the other one. So we managed to win the championship that way.
Later on, after Jack Brabham had come over to Europe, you kept in touch. Well, he kept in touch with you, and you, I think, had some design input in some of the F1 Coopers that he was racing at the time. Yes,
well, we used to write air letters in those days, and Jack wasn't a very prolific writer, and neither was I, but we did the odd one, and I'd meet him occasionally when he came out to do the Tasman series. And then he emailed me, and I still got the letter, suggesting that they could lower the engine by about 3 inches, put a pair of spur gears in to go up to the gearbox, and so he suggested that I design it and the bell housing and get a pattern made. So I did that, and when he came out, he put the pattern under his arm from the Tasman series and took it back to England, and that became the part of the low line. The other thing he did was because Cooper had always had transverse leaf springs on the top of the car at each end, and he wanted to modernise it, which was against Charlie Cooper's wishes. So he asked me to come up with some dimensions, so I drew the relative lengths for the top wishbone and the angles they should be at, and again emailed it back to him. And he got it into the car by, I think John Cooper knew, but Charlie no. And so he went to the draftsman, and they just fed the thing in the back door, so it became the draftsman's ideas, and they built it, and then it worked, so Charlie had to go along with it. So they were the two main things that I contributed.
And then, of course, Jack Brabham invited you to come over to Europe. That was a big decision at the time, and was it a hard one to make?
I don't know why my wife agreed, because in those days you couldn't get transatlantic flights and things like that very easily, but Jack offered to pay my return fare to go over for 6 months trial, and I was quite happily married with a 4-year-old daughter, and I wasn't going to leave them behind. So I think the reasons for coming over, the police in Australia in those days were pretty severe on the roads, as they were in America, and I had 3 offences for speeding against me. And I thought, well, I'll clear those by going to England, and I thought I was going to drive when I went to England, as well as designing and building cars. I thought, well, that will just further the whole thing. So I had to go to America on the way to attend a race and race engineer Jack's Keeper sports car on the way, and so my wife and daughter were put on a boat with the goods and chattels, and I flew to America and then on to England, and that's how it all happened.
Then when you eventually arrived in England and went into business with Jack Brabham, you formed Motor Racing Developments, or MRD, which then, of course, became known as Brabham later on. I think there's an interesting story as to how that came about.
Yes, well, we had appointed, or Jack had appointed Jacky in France as our agent, and he was over in France, and he gave me a call and said, look, it's got a bad annotation in French. MRD means covered all over in shit. Can we change the name? And he suggested Brabham. That, I suppose, really put me on the back step from then on for the rest of the career, because everything became Brabham's. But at the same time, it made the thing more publicly knowledgeable, and so it made the company a better, or a more valuable company with that name.
Because Brabham in the 60s became really the leading manufacturer of customer single-seater cars. What things do you think helped that to come about?
Well, there's probably a number of things. Firstly, Jack didn't anticipate me driving over there. He thought I had to work and design cars, and I did a couple of laps around Brands at one stage, and then I realised that if something happened to me, we had no money, and my wife was there in a strange land with a 4-year-old daughter, so how was she going to get on and get back to Australia? So I suppose you can take it from that I wasn't a racing driver, because racing drivers don't give a damn. If they're going to be a champion, they just drive whatever the risks. And so I just built cars. So that meant that I didn't have any driving distractions, but having driven was useful because you knew the sort of things that a car had to have to be good. I think the other thing was that since it was going to be a joint venture, the first year I was involved in F1, but at the end of the year, Jack, who already had his own organisation for running in the Tasman in private races, even when he was with Cooper, wanted to actually run his own team and me not be involved. So that was agreed. So my priority was production racing cars. Formula One came distinctly second, and he often never got his own Formula One cars because I think he offered to pay the company, which was jointly owned, £3,000 each for his cars without the engine, and so he'd get his cars probably by the time of Monaco. In the meantime, I was building production cars, which was the whole thing that I was interested in. This changed, of course, at the end of at the beginning of '66, at the end of the 1.5 litre formula, because I told Jack I didn't want to be bothered with Formula One anymore. I just built production cars, and we ran our own Formula Junior or the lower Formula teams in that year, which was again from the Motor Racing Developments or Brabham Racing Developments Company. So.
What do you think was better about the Brabhams than, say, the competition at the time in terms of customer cars?
I think every part, when I built a car, that car ran all year, and I applied engineering technique to building them. So the workshop people never had any say in, after the prototype was built, in how the cars were built. Now, other manufacturers' cars were almost like one-offs each time, so you couldn't have a store full of parts which you could send anywhere around the world and they always fitted, but every part of every Brabham and Ralt was identical, and you could take them out and fit them. And I think that's because of my background was in engineering and design for production, and so it had to be precise.
In 1968, the Brabham BT26 was one of the first Formula One cars to sport aerofoils. When did the idea first come to you?
I think it was the previous year for Spa. I'd made a couple of little nose fins or bibs, and I put them on for a lap at Spa, and Jack did the lap and come in and said, "That's great, but it's on the wrong end of the car." So we whipped them off and hid them, and the following year came up with an airfoil mounted over the engine so that we could trim it backwards and forwards. I think the following day Ferrari appeared with one mounted in an identical position, but obviously they had it already made and just pulled it out a day later than us.
And of course that was the start really of the current emphasis on aerodynamics and downforce, and of course quite soon after the small aerofoils appeared over the engine, things escalated.
Yes, well, I think the following race meeting was Rouen, and Chapman, once he sees an idea, develops it to the extreme, often with unfortunate circumstances. So he came up at Rouen with a huge aerofoil mounted on the rear uprights, and that wasn't entirely successful at Rouen, but we carried on from there and all had bigger bigger wings, etc. And then at a meeting at Montjuic Park in Barcelona, there were two accidents with the Lotuses, where the airfoil came off and leapt over the fence, and also in one of the Brabhams, the leading edge split and the airfoil collapsed in the middle. I think it was on Jacky Ickx's car. So the following race meeting was at Monaco, and that led to a ban after the first practice of airfoils. After the ban, I think the next race was Zandvoort, and although you weren't allowed to have airfoils, you could have whatever body shape you liked. So I made an engine cover with a ducktail on the back, which would create the downforce that would potentially give us what we needed. And at Zandvoort, I think there was an early practice, unofficial practice sessions on the Wednesday, and me being a fool, produced this engine cover and we ran it, and Chapman saw it and got some of his team members together and headed back home, and appeared a couple of days later in time for the race with a replica, and things went on from there.
Around that time you had two of the drivers who are perceived as being the future of motor racing, up-and-coming drivers, Jochen Rindt and Jacky Ickx. How do they compare?
Well, Rindt I got along very well with, contrary to people's opinions. They think he was a little bit arrogant, but I found that if you talked sense to him, he always answered well. And in fact, we shared a room, because in those days there wasn't a lot of money in racing, and so everyone had to have dual occupancy, and so they had money of their own. So Rindt and I shared, and it went on very well. He wasn't particularly technical, although I think he was learning. The following year we had Ickx, and the things had changed by then. We had switched from the Repco engine, which was a disaster in '68, and had a Cosworth for Ickx in '69. And I think there's a difference. He never ever showed up at the workshop. He'd arrive just in time for first practice and leave immediately after the race. It didn't really mix in with the people, and he didn't show any form until Jack had an accident at Silverstone when he was tyre testing, and a tyre blew up. I think they were testing two-ply tyres, and it failed, and he had his accident and broke his ankle, so he couldn't drive for a few races. And that's when Ickx's driving talent came to light. I think he needed things centred around him, and it showed up. But again, a little later in the season, at Monza, he got an offer to go back to Ferrari, which he couldn't refuse, and so off he went.
Rindt almost came back to Brabham's in 1970. Do you think if he had gone to Brabham and not stayed with Lotus, that he might have been world champion in 1970 in a BT33?
It's possible, but probably no more likely than Jack being world champion, because Jack would have won that year except for 3 circuit incidents. At Brands he actually passed Rindt, and Rindt was in his Lotus, and ran out of petrol with 1 corner to go, and so he came in second. And that was down to one of our mechanics leaving the Lucas fuel injection on rich, which you have to start up instead of turning it down to that. And the mechanic, we didn't know who it was until about 2 years ago, and he finally owned up to it. So that was one race where he came second instead of first, and it could have been either. Another one was Monaco, and Jack had a huge lead, but he got held up going up the hill behind Siffert, who was swishing the car from side to side to try and pick up the last drop of petrol. I think Jack lost 8 or 10 seconds just on 1 lap, and he would have still won, but he thought Rindt was closer than he was. I was giving him signals, but the signals you gave behind the pit in those days at Monaco, and so Jack tried to do the last bit of the last lap very quickly, and he took the inside line because there wasn't room down the outside of a slower car, and ended up on the pebbles, or marbles I think they're called, when he was braking and just slightly overshot. He went into the sandbags at the corner, still could have backed out and won, but one of the marshals wanted to push him, and Jack wouldn't move the car backwards until he got the marshal out of the way, otherwise he would have been disqualified. And he lost several seconds doing that, and he backed it out, and Rindt had gone by and he came second.
After Jack Brabham retired at the end of 1970, you ran Brabham's for a while and then eventually sold to Bernie Eccleston, who's obviously gone on to much greater things since then. You didn't stay on after that. Why was that?
Well, it's a matter of where I start the story. I don't think the top mechanic, which is Ron Dennis and Neil Trudnell, believed that Jack was going to retire, so they stayed on, and then right at the end, it was almost Christmas, they really found out he definitely was retiring, so they then left to start their own business with Rondell. So the following year I had to find another chief mechanic very quickly, and I got a recommendation from Jack, from one that he'd worked for, but it turned out to be a disaster. So that wasn't a very happy year for me, so that set the seeds for me to sell out. Also, you needed to be fairly expert at going around and getting sponsorship, and I wasn't really interested in doing those things. I didn't want to wine and dine people. I didn't have the expertise in that area, so it meant taking on someone else. So Rindt introduced me to Bernie, who then wanted to buy half the thing. I said, no, I don't want another partnership experience, so it's all or nothing. So he agreed to buy me out, and that went not well in my favour, but at least we did the job. And then come Christmas time, I always took a fortnight off work to go skiing with my family, and I missed about 4 days of work, so nothing much could go wrong in those 4 days. But Bernie had done some negotiation with Colin Seeley to take over his motorbike business to combine the whole lot. And when I came back from my holiday, my drawing board space was gone, and the business was being run without me. So I did stay on, and eventually the accountants who normally gave me a cheque out of my company funds, or told me to write a cheque for so much each month, they were told not to give me a cheque anymore. The rest of the accounting and cheques were done within the business, and so anyway they said, but you can write your own, which I did. So things didn't look as though I was really wanted around, and gradually I was sort of squeezed out.
During your time at Brabham, you were responsible for something like 600 cars, and then at Ralt afterwards over 1,000. In that long list of cars, which are the ones that you got particular affection for, or which ones are you proud of?
Yeah, proud of it. I don't have affection for anything. I would think in the Brabham days, the 24, it was really the first car of the new era that I'd actually designed specifically for it. Although we won the championship with the 19 the year before, it was really a car made for the 1.5 litre Climax 16 cylinder, which didn't ever come out. So we did a quick conversion job to run that, and then the 24 came out, and I think again it had specific designed front uprights and suspension compared to the Triumph Herald ones that we'd used up to that date, and it was fairly tidy as a car goes. Then if we move on to the next era, which was Ralt, I think the first one I did was the RT1, and it was the most versatile of all the cars because it ran in 4 formula. It was the same basic car with just different size fuel cells. It was in Formula 3, Atlantic, Super V, Formula 2, with these different cells. So that went on for a few years, being successful until although there were developments each year, it was basically the same car until we ended up in start of ground effects in 1979, 1980, and then it had to change. And I suppose once we get into that era, Formula 3, the 35 was very good, because although it was just an aluminium, some monocoque reinforcing, it was still a winner the following couple of years against cars which were carbon fibre monocoques and so forth, and it was still quite successful. I think following that, when I went into carbon fibre, the RT40 Atlantic car, again in its first year, it swept the field in America, and that and its successor, which was just a development, the 41, went on winning until they wanted an American car to win, and they penalised with weight older cars and that, so they could get swift up front. And it wasn't worth designing a new car for the small sales there each year.
How did you fill in your time between the period of Brabham and then restarting Ralt?
I did a little bit of consulting work, probably starting with Frank Williams. I think he got me to race engineer the march that he'd been running down at Vallelonga, and then I was also asked to go out to South Africa and look after one of the cars out there. That was quite an experience. I arrived there and there'd been a practice day, and the quill shaft or the input shaft from the gearbox had seized in the back of the flywheel of the engine, and they had their truck and another thing, one tied onto each end. They were about to try and pull it apart when I arrived, and said, hold it, you know, you've got to take the gearbox to pieces and get the input shaft out. So that was the first experience with Frank. And then on a couple of other occasions he had other people designing and building a car, and they'd get it about 90% finished. It was all laid out and part built, and then they never finished the job. I don't know why, whether there was a financial problem or they built themselves into a corner. So one was the Polytoys, which I finished off, and the other one was the East Marlborough, and so that built up a good relationship with Frank, and he actually paid me. I had no problems for doing that. The other project was for Trojan, who had been agents for McLaren and were building their Formula 5000 car under some licence, and they wanted some work done on that. I think they were severing their relationship with McLaren, so I went there and modified a car for the 5000, or designed one, and then they wanted to race it, and I suggested that for the same price they could race a Formula 1 car as a 5000, so they agreed to do that. And then I needed help in the drawing office, so I somehow bumped into Patrick Head, who had done a one-off car for someone, and I employed him, and the two of us got to work and did the Trojan. We hit it off quite well, and he was more mathematically trained than I was, since he'd had a diploma and I had no education virtually, and it worked out very well.
Currently the historic motor racing scene's enjoying huge popularity, and of course some of the cars racing are ones that you were responsible for many years ago. What are your views on historic racing these days?
Well, thinking of the cars that I did, when we made them they weren't particularly safe, and a few years on with other things have happened to increase their performance, they're still not safe. And I think some of the rule makers and some of the drivers are obsessed with leaving the cars in the condition they were. Now, I'm not in favour of that. I think, they put taller roll bars on because that's obvious, and they put seat belts in. But if you look at the detail of how it's done, these things are just welded onto the sides of tubes, etc., and they don't convey the load fully over into the car. The other thing that I think needs to be done is the footbox area. If you look at a modern car, it's completely enclosed, and if you do have an accident, your feet don't get tangled up in tubes or on the steering column and that. And so it should be permitted to, or essential, to line that foot box area with, it can be lightweight honeycomb or plastic sheet or anything to stop you getting tangled up in the car. And if people want it to look original, they it only needs to go on with some tie wraps. You can take it out and make it original again. So I think a fair bit needs to be done towards the safety thing. I think some impact box on the nose could be hidden inside the nose box, and the sort of regulations in current cars need to be looked at and allowed, and these historic things. The problem is that a lot of the people that drive it have made it in life and become fairly wealthy business people, and they're living out their childhood dreams, which they never had time or money to do perhaps in the early days, and they think they're not driving at 10/10. But it only takes a blowout or another driver to lose it and knock you off the track, and you suffer the consequences. So that I'm not a real fan of historic racing, but I do go to meetings that I'm invited to, and unfortunately I tend to lecture these people on what they should do to their cars, so I don't know how long I'll be popular there.
So have you totally retired now, or are you still involved in any way with current racing?
Well, I do two or three things. I've been involved with the Formula V8 supercars in Australia for the last couple of years, and they're quite a challenge. They do not have a differential, and they've got a beam rear axle, and they're fairly tightly controlled with regulations, so you can't change a lot. So that was quite a challenge to be able to do some improvements to those cars each year. There's something in the wings for me to be involved with one of those series this coming year, but until I get back to Australia I won't know what it is. But I couldn't retire, I have to do something, and so I also am a senior design judge for Formula Student SAE for the last 3 years down in Melbourne, and there's cars from the unis from all over the world, and so it's interesting to put something back and try and help these young coming people. It's quite a good series, and if there's nothing else going, then I live in an apartment block which has got a gym and a pool attached, so I spend an hour and a half down there every morning.